One, two, three. Gonna talk about more film movements today. Film movements from the 1960s. We got 6 of them, packed decade. There's a lot of variety in this decade, a lot of sort of rebelling against restrictions, some countercultural stuff. So we'll start off with something that's not very countercultural, actually, with direct cinema. This is a style of documentary filmmaking which is aimed at unobtrusive, honest, up-close depictions of reality. This was primarily focused on in the US, France, and Canada. This became possible due to some technological advancements, handheld cameras and more portable and, lighter sound equipment made it possible to get in closer and, into different situations than you might be able to with larger, unwieldy rigs. The idea of this particular movement might sound similar to Cinema Verite, which we'll get to in a later decade, I'm not sure which one. Each of them are focused on getting close, getting true realistic depictions of scenarios. I would distinguish them by saying direct cinema is kind of meant to be 100% the event and the situation itself, whereas Cinema Verite can leave room for the director to be a character, the person living in that situation that they're exploring, and being a part of what's unfolding, kind of being a conduit for the audience to experience things through. Direct cinema is just the event, 100%. For an example, I'll talk about Crisis, Behind a Presidential Commitment. This short documentary focuses on JFK, as well as the southern side. I don't remember who the southern protagonist is, or the antagonist, however that would be framed. This is related to the integration of the University of Alabama. And I think this is interesting because this is an event, as someone who grew up in the US, that I had learned about. I think that really throws into relief the benefit that having video footage and a video archive of an event like this provides. Because there's just something more real about being able to see the events themselves and see JFK making calls and interacting with people and the police coming out in force and all that stuff. At this point, there was no 24-hour news cycle. Getting this kind of unique, candid, but also intense portrayal of political events like this must have been a real treat. And, even today, it would be interesting to see events like this, but the innovation for the time, I think, is perhaps difficult to understand given how commonplace footage like this is with the extreme portability and quality of technology we have now. But this is an important step and important implementation of technology. So I would recommend Crisis. Very insightful for me, at least, and perhaps it's a new historical event for people abroad. Next, Czech New Wave. I said in a previous video that free cinema is probably my favorite movement, and that may still be true, but Czech New Wave is very close, at the very least. Czech New Wave took place from the early 60s to 1968 in Czechoslovakia, surprise, surprise. This movement came about due to some relaxation of Stalinist policies, and this allowed for more creative freedom for artists, which is honestly spectacular the way it turned out. There's some extreme creativity on display and some uniquely delivered stories that I've not quite seen anywhere else. Many of these stories turned out to be political commentaries in some way or another, often slightly bizarre. This is another example where the whole movement isn't a monolith. There are a lot of bizarre films, perhaps something like Birds, Orphans, and Fools, which uses a extremely surreal and bizarre presentation style to comment on the way the war has affected a specific generation, or a report on the party and the guests, which has absurdly presented sort of dinner party scenario to comment on socialist policies and paranoia. But there's also kind of a plainer, more straightforward side to the movement. This can be seen in films like Something Different by Vera Hitlova, I believe is how her name is pronounced, who also, ironically enough, made Daisies, one of the other more bizarre films of the movement. Another film that perhaps highlighted the effect of war on a generation. But even within her work, you can see the crazy side, the extremely creative and bizarre side, and the almost ordinary, mundane style of Something Different, which basically contrasts and compares the lives of two very different women at two very different points in their lives. Some other films, for examples, are The Sun and Annette, which criticized, among other things, labor in socialist Russia. The Cassandra Cat, which is also known as When the Cat Comes. This is another one of the creative films, but perhaps tempered in a way. Perhaps this is a great introduction to the new wave for providing a taste of the creativity while not throwing you straight into the deep end of some of the other, perhaps less accessible films. This is a film that speaks to expectations and the behaviors that are kind of forced on people within the framework of communist Russia, and the way that people feel the need to act versus the way they would like to act versus their true natures. The cat itself is a great device for this. The film is extremely colorful, joyful at its peaks. This is really a tremendous watch experience as far as I'm concerned. I would recommend this one a lot. One other recommendation would be The Cremator. This is perhaps one of the best regarded films of the movement in terms of, critical reception and lasting memory. But yeah, I love the country's cinema. I talked about them in the top 5 country film histories video I did. And obviously a big part of that is the Czech New Wave. So would absolutely recommend watching stuff from this movement. I would recommend starting with either the Cassandra Cat or the Cremator. Next, we will talk about Cinema Novo. This is one of the 2, I would say, more revolutionary movements that we'll cover today. And conveniently, both of the revolutionary movements started in Latin America, which has kind of an interesting niche in film history at this point in time. This is a movement from the 60s and 70s. This initially came about as an effort of President João Goulart to unify the country and modernize it. The movement is often depicted as taking place in 3 waves, and I'll trace through each of them with a film from the movement's most notable director, Glauber Rocha. Wave 1, 1960 to 1964, and this is represented by Black God, White Devil. These films often concern the plight of the common man, a very common theme that will come up again later in this video with more movements, often having a certain harshness and encouraging the working class to action by unflinchingly and sympathetically portraying their plight. Wave 2, 1964-1968. This is represented by Entranced Earth. João Goulart was ousted in 1964, so that's kind of the start of the wave. He had made an effort to move the country further to the left politically, and when this event failed, some of the progress felt like it was being undone. This movement focuses perhaps on the failure of that particular institution, because the country moved back to the right a little bit more after this. So Entranced Earth seems to be, granted, I'm not intimately familiar with the politics of this time, but given that description that I was reading up on, it certainly seems like Entranced Earth could be seen as almost a retelling. Not to get into too much detail about the film, but it seems very, very clearly, very directly introspective about what had happened during this time period. And this, I would also say, this is also my favorite of this particular trio of films. So I definitely recommend Entranced Earth. It's got a lot of energy and vigor, almost venomous at certain points. Yeah, I like Entranced Earth a whole lot. I would recommend it very much. Wave 3, 1968-1972. And this particular part of the movement, Glauber Rocha perhaps doesn't have the best example, but just to keep the theme going, I'll use his movie Antonio das Mortes as an example, because that was the film he released during this time period, but it doesn't seem to be as tightly tied as some of the other films from this era. Did I say this was Brazil? This is Brazil. So this era had even more oppressive policies, which, of course, discouraged filmmaking. Films weren't able to be political in the same way, so they had to be a little bit less direct and more inventive about getting their ideas across. So perhaps in that way, Antonio das Mortes does fit this because it's a little less direct than, say, Entranced Earth was. This era was referred to as tropicalism, led to a more stylistically catchy, you could say, sort of aesthetic than the ideal of minimalism, which was present in the first couple of waves. And I think this is another movement that provides a lot of interesting historical value in terms of, like I said, with some of the second wave being so introspective, and with some of the first and third waves changing a little bit to accommodate the various levels of freedom they were allowed to have. So I think this movement gives a nice amount of cultural and historical insight into the country and society. All right, Japanese New Wave. So the start-stop times on the Japanese New Wave are a little bit vague, but generally late 50s to early 70s, something like that. This movement actually has a pretty interesting origin because it started out as an attempt by, Japanese studio system to manufacture a new wave, more or less, to manufacture progression and innovation in their cinema. Ultimately, their efforts kind of fizzled out. The filmmakers associated, well, basically, they didn't want to do what they were directed to do. They broke out, made their own stuff. The results were spectacular. The goals of many of these films parallel the French New Wave pretty close in terms of experimentation with the form and exploring possibilities with different deliveries on narratives. Additionally, they often addressed sexuality in some capacity. Obviously, films will change to reflect the times. Creators will often incorporate common concerns from the era, things that are common to discuss. So perhaps the focus on sexuality reflects a certain change in moral values or in at least discussion of the times in Japan. A lot of lasting works from this era were stylistically provocative or intense. Diary of a Shinjuku Thief is a fun one because, like I mentioned earlier, there are already some similarities to the French New Wave in terms of execution and ideals. And this is one that I've seen compared to some of Godard's work, Jean-Luc Godard. But this is a little bit more abrasive and in your face and, arguably even more experimental and in some of the ways like it uses color and black and white and some of the editing and whatnot. Death by Hanging, probably my favorite that I've seen so far from the movement. A bit of a shocking movie in a certain way, very darkly comedic. It uses this sort of shocking and eye-catching portrayal and subject matter to focus on Japan's treatment of the war after the fact and some of its judicial system. And then Hiroshi Teshigahara has made several noteworthy films from the New Wave, including, perhaps most notably, Woman in the Dunes, which may be the most well-received or well-remembered film of the movement. He didn't make just the one. He also made another film called Pitfall, which is perhaps a little bit more restrained, but still stylistically unique, pretty dark, thought-provoking stuff. Japan has, to their credit, one of the best, cinematic film histories. And the New Wave is no small part of that. And the sorts of innovations and uniqueness that the movement was able to provide through a variety of directors, even something perhaps more straightforward, but still stylistically intense, like Tokyo Drifter. Doesn't really fit in the same category, perhaps, as thematically as some of these other more serious films, but nonetheless a progression and a noteworthy stylistic statement among the other films of the New Wave. Next is Third Cinema. This is a film movement, as I alluded to earlier, starting in Latin America, another revolutionary film movement. This was essentially opposed to limiting cinema to a tool for capitalism, for colonialism, and using it to further the working class and further understanding of certain, intellectual ideas, revolutionary ideas that some of the filmmakers were trying to promote. The third in Third Cinema does reference third world countries. So there are 4 different manifestos associated with Third Cinema. I'll list them all, but there's one of them, the 4th one, that seems to be the most often referenced. The first one is Glauber Rocha's Aesthetic of Hunger. Glauber Rocha, of course, from Cinema Novo as well, an important figure in both, and his films kind of overlap the two movements a little bit. So his films you can watch for both of these for a taste of both. Julio Garcia Espinosa's For an Imperfect Cinema. Jorge Sanjines, his problems of form and content in revolutionary cinema. And then seemingly the most popular, like I alluded to earlier, Fernando Solanas and Octavio Getino, Toward a Third Cinema. This particular manifesto argues that it's impossible to subvert the current studio system, the current capitalist usage of cinema, while still utilizing some of its mechanisms, like distribution, for example. It called for not just distributing the films, but also making them events, like intellectual exercises, basically, following them up with discussion groups and using them to truly reinforce the revolutionary ideas found within. And they were very serious about using the films to promote ideas and intellectual discussions. The movement started in Latin America, but it ended up incorporating filmmakers from other third world countries around the globe. Some of them include various African countries, various Asian countries, and such notable filmmakers as Sembène Ousmane from Senegal and Satyajit Ray from India. Neither of them seem to be quite as specifically intense about the movement as perhaps some of the Latin American filmmakers who initiated it, but nonetheless, their films tend to fit some of the ideas, some of the highlighting of lower class and decrying perhaps institutions in general. Some notable works include, like I mentioned, Glauberosha, Entranced Earth, and would especially, I think, be a good fit here. Memories of Underdevelopment, which is a Cuban film, kind of focusing on a certain bourgeois attitude towards revolution and kind of trying to grapple with the current state of the country, which is depicted in some documentary footage throughout the film. And then Mandabi is a personal favorite of mine, a film that got me into African cinema, directed by Semben Usman. It's a film that depicts the government as a greater villain than even the most unlikable civilian. And I think this is a very impressive film because it manages to set up an unlikable character and turn them sympathetic by just changing the context of events around them. And I always think that's an impressive achievement. Love Mandabi. And then from Third Cinema, we'll go to the Iranian New Wave. The 60s and 70s brought a lot of change to Iranian culture. There was a significant attempt to modernize and westernize the country at this point, and eventually growing dissatisfaction from that effort led to a revolution in 1979, which turns out to be a bit of a breaking point in this movement. The Iranian New Wave became a sort of process for artists to discover cultural roots, cultural identity, share stories with the people. This is another film movement that is focused on the lower class. It took place more or less in three waves. The first wave from 69 to 79, again ending with that revolution time period. This is going to sound familiar, this description. It came about as a response to the sort of laziness or out-of-touch quality of a lot of prominent Iranian films at the time. The Cow is a great example. I don't see Abbas Kiarostami's The Traveler in here. I'm not really sure why. It certainly seems to fit the bill in terms of focusing on lower class, focusing on featuring children, realistic style, borderline documentary. So I would include The Traveler. I don't know if there's a specific reason why it wouldn't be, because Kiarostami himself shows up very frequently in the second and third waves of the movement. The second wave goes basically from the revolution until 1999. There seems to be a several-year lull post-revolution until more second wave films start showing up, and perhaps this is just simply due to upheaval. I'm not intimately familiar with the Iranian Revolution either, but mid-1980s really is when the wave seems to start, or at least the most notable films start to show up. Kiarostami is here plenty of times with films like Where is the Friend's House, Close Up, Taste of Cherry, but also filmmakers like Majid Majidi show up a couple of times with some notable works from the time period. And then the third wave is basically the 2000s. The most notable entry from this time period would probably be A Separation, which I believe got some awards attention. I didn't write down which it was, but I believe it got at least one Oscar nomination, Golden Globe, something to that effect. And although it's not technically part of any of these waves, it was a precursor to the Iranian New Wave. The House is Black is a notable documentary short covering a leper colony. And it's a really beautiful, heartbreaking film that, although it didn't get a lot of attention at the time, it now enjoys some amount of appreciation in cinema culture. So would recommend checking that out at the very least. The Cow is a lot of fun. Can't go wrong with Kiarostami. He is an extremely well-regarded director. And that'll do it for the 1960s. 6 movements, all of them quite a lot of fun to explore and think about, especially some of the philosophical uses, I think, of cinema in regard to revolution and the way Latin America approached cinema as a tool. So the next time, cover the 70s, I guess. See you in that video.